Welcome back, Wonders. It's Naidra. I wanted to apologize to my loyal subs for not posting anything last week. I was planning on posting updated builds for both the Frostwall and also for the Spark Stormweaver build, but unfortunately I did get caught up with some friends and festivities for the holidays and just didn't get an opportunity to post like I wanted to. However, I am back and I'm really excited. In the process of updating my Frost Stormweaver build, I accidentally bumped into something that has been extremely fun to play and it's super OP. And the part that I love about it the most is it's really not complicated. It's super easy to use. And most of the time you're really only using one button to make this build work. Other times you may be using up to 3 buttons at most, but you're not button smashing throughout your gameplay, making this super easy to use and also super fun as well. And so with that, today I'm going to show you guys my newest Fireball Comet Stormweaver build, which sounds really complicated, but again, it's super easy to use. And like all of my other builds, this is really not going to cost you very much if you decide to switch over to this. Most of the gear, which I will show you guys in just a little bit, will cost 1 to 5 exalted orbs at most. There's only one piece of equipment that costed me more than that, which was 1 divine orb, and that's the amulet. And once again, I'll show you guys how all of that works in just a few minutes. So we'll start off with showing you guys what this build is and how it operates, and then we'll dive into our equipment. We'll take a look at our skills and all of that other good stuff as well. Before we dive into it though, if you guys haven't subscribed yet, please don't forget to smash that subscribe button below. Let's go ahead and dive right in. Alrighty, so first and foremost, what's going to be happening here is we're casting 3 spells, but like I said, most of the time we're really only going to be casting 1. The first one we're going to be casting is Fireball, and what Fireball is going to do is it's going to trigger your Raging Spirits to be summoned, and then once your Raging Spirits die, then we're going to use Cast on Minion Death to trigger comets. We're going to see a lot of comets falling from the skies, which is going to be really great to see and super easy. The best part about it is we're not having to aim at anything, we're just blindly shooting, and then the comets will do everything else for you. So the majority of the damage isn't necessarily going to be coming from Fireball, it's going to be coming from your Comet. So again, most of the time you're just going to be clicking your Fireball button. However, in the event where you run into elite monsters or unique monsters, that's where you're going to want to use your other 2 skills as well, which is going to be Eye of the Winter, and we're also going to be using Conductivity. In this specific build, we are going to be using all 3 elements, and so it is important that we're using Conductivity to make sure that we reduce the enemy's lightning resistances, and then same thing with Eye of Winter, that's really just going to cause additional exposure, which allows us to deal even more damage in return. And so with that, let me show you how this works really quick, and then we'll go back to town and I'll show you what's making it work and what you guys can do to put this build together. So since we're not fighting an elite, we'll just go ahead and shoot out our fireballs. As you'll see, the whole entire screen will light up with fireballs and taking everything down pretty quickly and pretty easily. So this is a pretty brainless build and super easy to use. You can cast these from across the room and it'll kill enemies before you even end up getting there. You do need a bit of mana to make this build work, and again, we'll take a look at the details in a minute here, but it makes it super easy to use, unlike a lot of those button smashing builds, which makes it really difficult to play. And so what is happening here, besides just the comets, is we're also casting Ice Wall when the minions explode. And again, really fun to play, and you can play around with this a little bit and decide how you want to make it work, but essentially it's just casting automatically on its own, so you're really not having to do very much. So that's pretty much it. If we end up running into any elites, we'll cast Conductivity first and Eye of Winter, and then that's when we can start casting our fireballs. If you'd like, and if you have enough spirit to do so, you can also add Blink onto this just in case you end up getting stuck in some kind of corners. But for the most part, like I said, your enemies are going to be dead before you even end up getting to them, so you really shouldn't have to worry about it too much. So now that you guys see how this build works, which again, super easy, just one button most of the time, let's go back to town and see exactly what's making this happen. Alrighty, so taking a look at our equipment, we're going to start off with our wand first. For our wand, we really just want to get something that's pretty generic. In case you guys decide you want to try out different builds, we want to try not to pick something that's only specific to this build, but you'd be able to use with something else. And so in this case, what we have here is for an implicit, we've got +1 to all cold skills. That one is pretty targeted towards the Comet. However, the rest of the stats at the bottom are going to be usable with pretty much any other build as well. So starting off with increased spell damage, we do want to have spell damage specifically. We want to try to avoid increased damage to fire or increased damage to cold or lightning. That way, this will impact all of your elements. And like I mentioned earlier, we are using all 3 elements with this build. So getting increased spell damage is going to be really, really helpful. And obviously, the higher the percentage we can get, the better. Next up, we want to have as much maximum mana as possible with this as well. This build does require a lot of mana, so we want to try to pick that up on every piece of equipment possible. And then we have +2 level to all spell skills. You obviously can go higher than the +2, but for now, that's all I was able to get. I didn't really want to spend too much time going through the trade website, so I'm sticking with this for now. But if you can get +4 or more to all skills, that would be really great as well. With this build, we are relying on critical strike chance and critical strike damage pretty frequently, and so we want to make sure we also have critical hit chance for spells on your weapon as well. And then lastly, you don't necessarily need the increased cast speed. We'll definitely take it. It's not a problem. But if you can, I would highly recommend trying to get something that's going to give you increased mana regeneration. Again, mana is super crucial for this build. So if you can get that, it's going to help you out quite a bit. Taking a look at our gloves, we're just using regular gloves with this build. And so what you want to make sure you have on here is definitely increased energy shield. We are going to want as much energy shield as possible as well. That's going to help us with our tank ability. We don't care too much about the accuracy rating, so that one you can skip. We do want to have maximum life, and we also want to have maximum mana, as much of that as possible on here. And then lastly, if you can get gloves that have tri-res, that would be great. But if not, then you can get something similar to what I have here, which is fire resistance, cold resistance as well. And then I've also added a rune to add some additional cold resistance on top of that as well. Taking a look at our first ring, we have a prismatic ring, and we're going to be using prismatic rings for both of our rings. And this is because prismatic rings will grant you an implicit of plus to all elemental resistances. So overall, this will help with your tankiness as well. Now, for the first two stats that we have on here, we absolutely can do without. We don't need the physical damage. We don't need the accuracy rating. But what we do need is we need as much resistances as possible. If you can get something that's going to give you plus to mana or mana regeneration, that would be extremely helpful as well. We don't really care too much about the life regeneration at the bottom either. With this build, because we are killing everything so quickly and oftentimes before you even reach the monsters in the next room, we are not too worried about the life regeneration, but just in case something manages to get over to you, we still want to make sure we've got resistances and we've got some tankiness and energy shield as well. Taking a look at our helm, I think this one is pretty straightforward. We're using Etziri's Disdain. I think this is a pretty standard item to use for most sorceress builds right now. It gives you maximum mana, you're getting some rarity of items found, but then we're also getting some benefits with your energy shield, where you're getting 25% of your max life as extra maximum energy shield as well. So really, really good to have. And then taking a look at our chest armor, I am using the Ghost Wraith Tattered Robe. It's up to you if you'd rather use a rare item for this. You're more than welcome to. If you're finding that you're needing more resistance, then it might be a good idea to get a rare armor that has dual or tri resistance on there as well. But if you do something like that, just make sure that you're getting some maximum energy shield from it as well. That's going to be imperative for this build. And then of course, if you're doing that, you might as well also pick up some mana or some additional life with that chest armor too. So if you need more resistances, or if you're finding that you're not quite at the cap without using this, you're more than welcome to swap it for something else. But if you're already feeling pretty good, this is going to be helpful, especially because it is converting 50% of our max life to energy shield, keeping us tanky in that aspect. And then taking a look at our belt, we're using Midnight Braid. Similar idea here. If you're finding that you're still struggling with your resistances, you could always just get a regular rare belt that's got additional resistances. We just want to make sure you're getting some more mana on there as well. And then of course, if you can get some energy shield or something of that nature, that would be great. But the primary thing we want to look at here is maximum mana and some elemental resistances. I like this one specifically because we're getting +10 to all of our resistances, but then also 50% of the damage that we take is recouped as mana too, so that helps us keep us on track with mana a little bit more. For our amulet, this is the most expensive item that we have on this build. Everything else costed about 1 to 5 at most exalted orbs. This one costed me 1 divine orb. However, it's definitely worth it. This is what's really pulling the whole build together and allowing us to do what we're doing with this. And what I mean by that, the most important affix from here is we take 100 fire damage when we ignite an enemy. And because of the way that we have our passive skill tree set up, instead of us taking that damage, it's going over to our minions. And that's what's making the minions die so much faster, which is also what's triggering Comet that much faster as well. So If there's anything on here that we absolutely need to make this build work, I would say it's this Fireflower Solar Amulet. Next up, we have our second ring. Similar to our first one, it's a prismatic ring. We're getting +9 to all elemental resistances as our implicit. The nice thing about this specific one is we're also getting +14 to all elemental resistances in addition to that. Now, we don't care very much about the additional physical damage, so we absolutely can do without that. So if we can replace that with something like maximum mana or mana regeneration would be really great. But if not, at least make sure that you've got your maximum life on here. We've got some kind of resistances as well, and that should be good. Taking a look at our boots, we are using rare boots. The most important affix on here is going to be the movement speed. We want to make sure that we're keeping this build as agile as possible. Now, again, in most cases, you're firing off your fireballs and they're shooting out comets before you even get to the next room. So in most cases, your enemies are probably going to be dead before you even get to them. But just in case you're facing a breach or something of that nature, we want to make sure we're as agile as possible and try to step away from the monsters while our frost walls activate, giving you an opportunity to shoot out more fireballs. So movement speed, extremely important. If you can get 30% for this would be even more helpful, but 20% seems to be good enough for what we're doing here. The other important thing on here is our increased energy shield. Like I mentioned, energy shield is crucial. We want to have as much tank ability as possible. And then the +152 to maximum mana is really, really good. And we definitely need at least 150 or more of this. Next up, we've got increased rarity of items found. That's great to have so you can find more equipment. However, that's not necessary to make this build work. But what is necessary is we want to have as much resistances as possible. So if you can get tri-res on here as well, that would be really helpful. I did add a rune that allows us to get additional lightning resistance on here, which is really what brings me all the way up to a cap for pretty much all of my resistances. So this works out well, but if you're finding that you need something else on here, or if you're already at max, then you can put in a rune that maybe gives you additional mana. It's up to you what you want to do as far as that goes. And then lastly, instead of using a focus, this is important that we are using a scepter. And the reason for that is because we need as much spirit as possible. The minimum spirit you want to have on your scepter is at least 60% to make this build work. And the reason for that is because we are using cast on minion, which is a buff, and that does require spirit. And then we're using a couple of other things that'll require it too. So first and foremost, must have at least 60% spirit. We want to try to avoid anything that has an implicit of summoning minions. So for me, I'm using Purity of Lightning. The best way to go with this would be to get Malice if you can find something that has Malice. However, Purity of Lightning works really well for me, especially because most of the times when I'm playing, I am playing with my friends. And so this Purity of Lightning does help. The other thing that I would recommend trying to get on here, and I did initially have before I veiled it, was plus to maximum mana. I had plus 150 on here, but when I veiled it, I ended up getting that removed on accident, but it replaced it with increased mana regeneration rate. That is still helpful, so it's not the worst thing that could have happened, but if I had a preference, I would have preferred to have kept the plus 150 to mana. So when you're looking for a scepter, if you don't already have one, plus increased spirit at least 60% or more, plus the maximum mana. Try to avoid any type of affixes that buff your minions' defenses or your minions' resistances. We want the minions to die as frequently as possible, so we definitely want to avoid buffing them and buffing their defensives. Now, with that said, let's go ahead and take a look at our skills, and then we'll follow that up with taking a look at our passive skill tree. All right, so taking a look at our skills, first and foremost, we got our first cast on minion death. And with this, we're pairing it up with Comet. And then we'll also take Spell Cascade, following that up with Inspiration. And then lastly, we're going to have Spell Echo on here. Next up, we've got Grim Feast, which we only need to pair this one up with Clarity. And then we've got our Fireball, which we're going to be pairing up with Scattershot, and then Unleash. And finally, we're going to be taking Ricochet with that as well. And also for Fireball, we want to try to keep this at a lower level if possible. We don't want our Fireball doing so much damage that it's destroying our frost walls. So try to keep this at the lowest level possible. We just need to trigger this so that it'll trigger the Raging Spirits as well. Keeping in mind that Raging Spirits is summoned when you use any fire skill, and this one is going to be able to summon the most possible. But like I said, in order to maintain our frost walls, we want to try to keep this Fireball to a minimum level. Next up, we've got Eye of Winter, which we're going to pair up with Strip Away, Cold Exposure, and then lastly, Inevitable Critical. And then we've got our Raging Spirits, which we're pairing up with Infernal Legion, and then Feeding Frenzy, and finally, Minion Instability. For our second cast on Minion Death, we are using Frostwall for this. We want to try to have as high of a level as Frostwall as possible. This is what's going to have higher Ice Crystal life. You can also add additional Ice Crystal life on your passive skill tree. Then we're also pairing this up with Fortress and finally Lightning Exposure. For our Conductivity, we're going to be pairing that up with Focused Curse. And then we'll move over to Heightened Curse and finally Hex Bloom. And then lastly, we have Archmage on here, which is a buff, and we're going to be pairing that one up with Lightning Mastery. And as you can see, we do have an empty slot so that we can add Blink if we end up getting enough Spirit to get to that point. But for now, we're going to keep it as it is. Another thing that I plan to add later on is Sigil of Power, but unfortunately, I don't have that available to me just yet. So we'll go ahead and leave this blank in the meantime, but this is what our skill tree is going to look like. And then we'll wrap this up by taking a look at our passive skill tree as well. So for our passive skill tree, this is a Stormweaver build. So for the ascendancies, we are going to go over to the left and the right from the beginning. And then we're going to go on down to Constant Gale and finish it up with Force of Will. And then we're going to go ahead and move our way up on the right-hand side towards Pure Energy, where we'll continue to make our way up to Mana Blessing and take Dampening Shield as well. And curve over to the left, where then we'll stop and take Heavy Buffer and the nodes surrounding it. Now for this one, it is completely optional. If you'd like to replace your energy shield for more damage output, you're welcome to take these off and put them elsewhere. However, for me, I'm finding that this is really helpful because we do want to have as much tankability as possible, especially as you get into the later tiers of mapping. You're going to want to make sure you can take at least a couple of hits. And so I do find that this is extremely helpful. We'll then make our way over to the left, where we will stop and grab Repulsion along with Desensitization. And then we'll move on up and we'll grab Calibration before we make our way over to All Natural for some additional elemental resistances and increased elemental damage. And then on the right hand side, it is really, really important that we're grabbing this Necromantic Talisman. This is what's allowing our minions to take the damage from the amulet instead of us taking it. And this is what's killing our minions a little bit faster, which in turn is also allowing us to summon more comets, summon more frost walls a lot quicker. So as far as the passive skill tree goes, this is probably one of the most important nodes that you can possibly take to make this build work more efficiently. And then going on back over to the center, we will go up to Sudden Escalation before we make our way up to Overexposure, taking the 3 nodes that are around that as well. We'll continue to make our way up before we go over to the right, and we're going to be grabbing Controlling Magic. This gives us additional critical strike chance. Again, we are dealing a lot of critical strikes. We are going to be doing a lot of critical strike damage as well, so it is really important that we're grabbing this node. We'll then make our way over to the right, where we'll grab Patient Barrier for some more energy shield. If you need more intelligence, you can go ahead and grab the Ingenuity node down here. I'm finding that at this point, I don't need more, so I'll probably circle back to this at a later point. But for now, we'll go ahead and skip that and make our way down to our raw mana. Also grabbing Arcane Intensity, Ether Flow, and finally Eldritch Battery. Now, this is really important to have because this gives us a significant amount more mana than what we currently have, and that's what allows us to keep going. So definitely make sure you pick this up. And then we'll continue to make our way over to the right, where we're going to pick up Energize along with Invocated Efficiency as well for some additional spell damage. And then if you're a higher level than me, you're going to continue to make your way over to the right, where then you will be taking the Careful Assassin node and the nodes around it. And then eventually you'll make your way on down to the Empty Jewel Socket and over to True Strike and for the Jugular. And then if you still have enough points, you'll finish it off with Deadly Force. So that's where you'll eventually end up with this build. But for now, I am currently at level 80. And so unfortunately, I'm not able to get past this point, but this is what your passive skill tree is going to look like. Now, with that said, that's all I have for you guys for today. Thank you guys so much for watching and joining me. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below. Until next time, Wonders.